Hello, Psych 101 students, and welcome to Module 4, Learning Objective 6. We will look at classical conditioning in this learning objective. So Ivan Pavlov was a Russian physiologist and was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1904 for research on the digestive system. So one of the things he studied was salivation in dogs, because salivation is the first stage of digestion. So he was not a psychologist. He did not set out to study conditioning. He was studying digestion. And what happened was that his digestion study was, being disrupted because the dog was salivating just at the sight of bowls of food. Before they could taste or smell them, the dogs were, starting to salivate before the food was ever presented to them. And what he was studying was how much they salivate, when they get food and when they eat food. And so he kind of stumbled upon this idea of conditioning because it just happened naturally. He wasn't trying to condition them, but over time, the dogs got used to, the the procedure. When they were being fed, there was, the food bowl would be gotten out and filled up or whatever, and so certain sounds or sights or the sight of the food bowl would make them start to salivate, and so this was actually disrupting his experiments, but he found it so interesting that he pursued it. So as it says here, Pavlov observed that dogs began to salivate as soon as they saw bowls of food. Salivating at the sight of a bowl is not automatic. This was, what was interesting to him is they started salivating before they ever saw or tasted or smelt the food. They were just seeing the bowl. It was a new behavior that they had acquired through learning by association. They associated the bowl with food. So Pavlov originally called this psychic reflexes. It's like the dogs are being psychic, knowing that they were about to be fed. But it later became known as classical conditioning once John B. Watson got involved and did much more experimentation on the topic. So let's start by taking a look at an example in a video. So this is a video from the show The Office. Let's take a look at some conditioning taking place here. Okay, so that is an example of classical conditioning from the show The Office. Okay, so here's a picture of Ivan Pavlov. He's the white bearded man pictured there with, a bunch of colleagues and one of his canine subjects. And, he conducted what is now known as, real groundbreaking work on the topic of classical conditioning. This is the setup he used and the apparatus he used. The dog would be placed in a harness like this and would be presented with a bowl that contained meat. There's a tube that connected to one of the dog's salivary glands, and the tube would carry saliva to a container, or like a type of measuring cup, and the container was connected to a device that measured the amount of saliva that was produced, you know, over time. And so this was kind of the basic setup. And once again, he had the setup in place in order to study digestion and the production of saliva, but then he used the same setup, more or less the same setup, to study classical conditioning or psychic reflexes. So classical conditioning is a type of learned response in which a neutral object comes to elicit a response when it is associated with a stimulus that already produces a response. So if the sight of McDonald's golden arches makes your mouth water, you may have learned that the sign predicts that you might soon be eating tasty French fries or other McDonald's products. So if eating McDonald's food, already makes your mouth water, then the McDonald's sign, which is a neutral object, it can cause a similar response because the McDonald's sign becomes associated with McDonald's food in your mind. The two get paired together. And so now the sign itself can cause you to salivate because it makes you think of the food. Uh, Pavlov's experiments revealed 4 steps in classical conditioning. We'll go through them. Step 1, begin with the stimulus that naturally elicits a response. We call this an unconditioned stimulus. It's a stimulus that naturally elicits a response without any prior learning, such as food. Dogs respond to food, from the time they're born. They never had to learn to respond to food. It just naturally occurs. It is a type of stimulus that will always generate a response in a dog. The unconditioned response is a response that does not have to be learned either, such as a reflex. So once again, ever since a dog was born, when it was presented with food, it would salivate. And it didn't learn to do this. It was just born doing this. So this is a naturally occurring reflex action. Food causes a dog to salivate, naturally and innately. So the word unconditioned refers to instinctive reflexes or other behaviors that are not formed or influenced by learning. They already exist. So, like I said, food always causes a dog to salivate. It never had to learn to do it. So that's why the word unconditioned is here. It's naturally occurring. Okay, in step 2, a neutral stimulus is presented. And a neutral stimulus is anything not previously associated with the unconditioned response. And what Pavlov used was a metronome. It's a device that produces a steady pulse or clicking sound to help musicians play in time. And the neutral stimulus does not cause a dog to salivate. So in step 2, you actually test that. You play the metronome a little bit, the neutral stimulus, and check, is there any extra saliva being produced? And the answer would be no. And there's no reason that this sound would make the dog salivate. So it's neutral, in terms of producing saliva. Okay, in step 3, we start the learning or the conditioning trials. The neutral stimulus, the metronome, is presented together with the unconditioned stimulus, the food. And over a number of these pairings, the dog begins to associate the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. So the metronome becomes associated with food because they're being presented together. And because of this, they get paired together in the animal's brain. It's like, oh, I always hear this clicking sound, and right before I get food. So eventually, what the neutral stimulus is going to become what is known as a conditioned stimulus. Once you do enough of these conditioning trials, the neutral stimulus is going to change to become a conditioned stimulus, and we can test this in step 4. These are the critical trials. You want to see if the dog has learned to pair the metronome sound with food. Like, has this pairing taking place in the animal's brain? So, a conditioned stimulus is a stimulus that elicits a response only after learning has taken place. A conditioned response is a response to a conditioned stimulus, a response that has been learned. So the term conditioned refers to something that has been learned. That's all it means. So what we see is that the metronome alone, without food, makes a dog salivate now. Um, and and this is learned because we played the metronome before in step 2, and the dog didn't salivate. Now we play the metronome by itself, and the dog starts salivating. So the dog has a new response that it did not used to produce, or a new behavior or response. And this is what shows us that this dog has learned something. Just because we paired those things together, it now responds to this metronome sound in a similar way that it responds to food. Uh, so the term, once again, the term condition means something that's been learned. When and remember, the metronome is now considered a conditioned stimulus. It didn't used to produce a response, but the dog has learned to respond to it. So it changed from a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus. So this happens after step 3, and when we have the conditioning trials. And the salivation is known as a conditioned response, because even though dogs naturally salivate to food, they don't naturally salivate to metronome sounds. So it's a new response. So that's why we call it a conditioned response. It's a learned response. A quick note: the dog's not going to salivate as much to the metronome as they did to a bowl of food. And if we keep presenting the metronome sound and not giving him and not pairing it with food anymore, over time, the dog's going to salivate less and less to the metronome. Let's look at the 4 steps in picture format here. I'll zoom in. So this is Pavlov's classical conditioning. The hypothesis is that dogs can learn that a metronome predicts food. So step 1 is when food, the unconditioned stimulus, causes the dog to salivate, the unconditioned response. So once again, we know that this naturally occurs. And you put food in front of any dog, they're going to start salivating. So the food automatically causes the saliva. It's innate, means that you're born that way, right? Or another term is just naturally occurring. Okay. In step 2, the clicking metronome, the neutral stimulus, does not cause the dog to salivate. The dog may show an orienting response towards the sound, but it produces no saliva, which is the behavior being measured. So when you look at the picture here and it says no response in step 2, it doesn't mean the dog doesn't do anything. I mean, it might turn its head towards the sound, which is an orienting response, but that doesn't count as a response, because we're specifically looking at the behavior of salivation. So as far as salivation is concerned, there's no response. There's no extra saliva produced. Okay. Then in step 3, during conditioning trials, the clicking metronome is presented to a dog just before the food. You can see I added a picture here. It's important to realize that the dog's going to salivate in step 3 during the conditioning trials because it is getting food. We're presenting the metronome first, and then right after we present the metronome and its clicking sound, we bring out we give it a bowl of food, and the dog, of course, is going to salivate because there's food there. It's going to show its natural reaction. That's why I added this dog picture. So I want to point out the conditioning works best when the neutral stimulus is presented before the unconditioned stimulus. So when we talk about pairing them together, it does make a difference in the order, because the dog's going to learn that the neutral stimulus predicts the food. If the neutral stimulus comes after you bring the food out, it's not really serving a predictive purpose. They're still being paired together, but it's like, well, the food's already here. Now, then you bring out this clicking sound, like that's not giving me any extra information. So you always want the neutral stimulus to be presented before the unconditioned stimulus. Okay, finally we get to step 4. During the critical trials, the clicking metronome, the conditioned stimulus, is presented without the food, and the dog salivates, showing a conditioned response. And this is what demonstrates learning. Oh, we see up here, there was no response to the metronome. Now in step 2, now in step 4, we play the metronome and he starts salivating. I'm going to point out again that there would be less saliva in step 4 here than there would be to the food in step 1 or in step 3. When the dog actually gets food, he's going to produce more saliva. So even though he shows a response, it's not quite as strong as it would be to the actual unconditioned stimulus. Just like when you see the McDonald's arches, it might cause a little bit of saliva in your mouth, but it wouldn't be as much as if you were holding, McDonald's foods in your hands and being about to eat it. The actual food would cause more saliva production than seeing the signs. Okay. Once again, I will also point out, I know I said this before, but if I keep repeating step 4, so I bring out the conditioned stimulus, what's called a conditioned stimulus now, because it produces a response, conditioned response. If I keep doing this step over and over, each time the dog's going to salivate less. And if I do it enough without bringing up food, eventually the dog's going to stop salivating. So he's not going to salivate to this metronome forever if it never gets paired with food again. The learning's going to wear off in a sense. It's like it's like, oh, this clicking sound used to tell me when food was coming, but it doesn't do that anymore. I keep hearing it and there's no food. So the dogs will eventually stop responding to it. But we'll talk about that actually in another learning objective. Okay, the results. After conditioning, the metronome causes the dog to salivate, which is the conditioned response. Conclusion, the dog was conditioned to learn the association between the metronome and food. It paired the two together in its mind. Learning took place. And finally, to finish this learning objective, just one of these learning tip boxes. In classical condition, the word conditioned simply means learned, as shown below. So when we see unconditioned, like unconditioned stimulus, it's a stimulus that is not learned. So unconditioned means not learned. So it's something that instinctively or innately prompts a reaction. For example, food. A dog is born reacting to food. An unconditioned response is a response that is not learned. It's a reaction that is elicited instinctively or innately. Example, salivation. Dogs will salivate to food ever since they were born. Conditioned stimulus. Condition means learn. So stimulus that's learned, something that prompts a reaction only after learning has occurred. For example, McDonald's golden arches may cause you to salivate, but it wouldn't have done that when you were a baby before you ever had learned what it represented. You had to learn it over time. Conditioned response is a response that is learned. It's a reaction that's elicited only after learning it has occurred. For example, salivation at the site of McDonald's golden arches. Once again, that pairing had to be learned over time. You end up enjoying McDonald's foods, and every time you went to McDonald's, you saw the golden arches and you saw them on commercials, and so whenever you see them, it makes you think of the food that you like, and it causes you to salivate. Okay, last note, make sure that you check out the entertaining video clip of a college student conditioning his roommate. It follows this video in the list, and it's less than 2 minutes long, but it's a fun video. So make sure you take a look at it.